Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. And please do not forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. Your support means the world, and it helps bring more stories like this one to your ears as you drift off to sleep. Now, settle in, get comfortable. Let the sounds of the world fade away as we travel back in time together, to a place where the sky stretched endless over the Texas plains, where oil derricks pumped black gold from the earth, and where a football team was about to become something more than just a team. They were about to become a symbol, a myth, America's team. Picture this. It is a Friday night in October 1971. The autumn air carries that first hint of coolness, though in Texas, even autumn can feel like summer's stubborn refusal to leave. The cicadas have finally quieted after months of their electric buzzing, and the evening breeze carries the scent of grass and dust and the first fallen leaves of the season. But tonight, something special is happening. Something that will mark a turning point, not just for a football team, but for an entire city. 65,000 people are filing into a brand new stadium in Irving, Texas, just west of Dallas proper. The structure rises from the flat Texas landscape like something from the future, its partially open roof creating a halo effect against the darkening sky. Cars stretch for miles along the highways leading to the stadium, their headlights creating rivers of light across the prairie. Texas Stadium. The name itself seemed to claim something larger than any single team or city. This was Texas, and Texas did things bigger than anywhere else. They said God left a hole in the roof so he could watch his favorite team play. And tonight, for the very first time, the Dallas Cowboys are taking the field in their new home. The roar of the crowd washes over the stadium like a wave, building and building until it becomes something physical, something you can feel pressing against your chest. The lights blaze bright enough to be seen for miles, turning the stadium into a beacon visible from highways across the Metroplex. The artificial turf glows an impossibly vivid green under those lights, a colour that nature never intended. And somewhere in the stands, a father lifts his young son onto his shoulders so the boy can see over the crowd. The child clutches a pennant, the star logo of the Cowboys emblazoned in white against blue. His eyes are wide, taking in more sensory information than his young mind can process. He will remember this night for the rest of his life. The smell of popcorn and hot dogs mixing with cigarette smoke, and the perfume of the woman in the next row. The press of bodies around him, thousands upon thousands of people sharing this moment. The way his father's voice cracked with emotion when the Cowboys scored their first touchdown in their new home. This moment captures everything Dallas was becoming in the 1970s. A city of spectacle and ambition. A city that built monuments to its dreams and then filled them with cheering thousands. A city that refused to be defined by tragedy, even when tragedy had put it on the map in the worst possible way. Because just 8 years before this magical October night, Dallas had been known for something very different. Something dark. Something that the city had been trying desperately to escape ever since. This is the story of Dallas in the 1970s. A city transforming itself, a city shaking off the shadow of tragedy and reaching for something brighter, something that would make the world see it in an entirely new light. A city of oil, money and football glory, of disco nights and dangerous secrets, of cheerleaders who changed sports forever, and schemes that would make fictional villains blush with admiration. It is a story of excess and ambition, of dreams realized and innocence lost. It is the story of how a city became a symbol, and how that symbol, for better and worse, came to represent something essential about America itself in the final decades of the 20th century. The people who lived through it did not know they were making history. They were just living their lives, raising families, going to work, falling in love, making mistakes, chasing fortunes, losing everything, starting over. But looking back now, across the distance of decades, we can see how remarkable it all was. How a city that had experienced one of the great tragedies of American history reinvented itself as something glamorous, something exciting, something that millions of Americans wanted to watch every Sunday afternoon. So close your eyes if you like. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of your body sinking into wherever you are resting tonight. And let me take you there, to a time when the future seemed limitless, when the oil would never stop flowing, when the party never had to end. Let me take you to 1970s Dallas. To understand what Dallas became in the 1970s, you first have to understand what it was trying to leave behind. November the 22nd, 1963, a date that changed everything, not just for America, but for this particular city on the Texas plains. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on the streets of Dallas, shot as his motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza on a warm autumn afternoon. Within hours, the city's name had become synonymous with tragedy. The City of Hate, some called it. A place where the American dream had been murdered in broad daylight, where the optimism of a new decade had been cut short by bullets. For years afterward, Dallas carried that weight like a millstone around its neck. Business leaders worried about the city's reputation, watching conventions and corporate relocations go to Houston or Atlanta instead. Residents bristled at the assumptions outsiders made about them, the sidelong glances, when they mentioned where they were from. The shadow of Dealey Plaza seemed to stretch across every conversation about the city's future, every discussion about what Dallas meant and what it might become. Some Dallas residents avoided driving through Dealey Plaza entirely, taking longer routes to avoid the memories. Others passed through daily, the trauma becoming a kind of scar tissue that they learned to ignore. The Texas School Book Depository still stood at the corner of Elm and Houston, a daily reminder of what had happened there. It would not become a museum until decades later. In the 1970s, it was just a building people tried not to look at. But Dallas has never been a city content to look backward. This was a place founded by ambition, built by people who believed that tomorrow would always be better than today, that hard work and boldness would be rewarded, that the future belonged to those who seized it. And as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, something was stirring. A transformation was beginning that would remake the city's identity entirely. By 1970, Dallas was already one of the fastest-growing cities in America. New residents were arriving at a pace of nearly 1,000 per month, drawn by jobs, by opportunity, by the promise of something different from the struggling cities of the Northeast and Midwest. They came from Ohio and Michigan, where the automobile factories were beginning their long decline. They came from Pennsylvania and New York, escaping high taxes and cold winters. They were young people with college degrees and ambitions bigger than the places they left behind. These newcomers found a city that felt almost impossibly optimistic. The highways were new and fast, 6 and 8 lanes of concrete cutting through the landscape, making it possible to live miles from downtown and still commute in reasonable time. The buildings were modern, all glass and steel and sharp angles instead of the aging brick and stone they had left behind. There were jobs in insurance companies and banks, in oil company headquarters and technology firms. The economy seemed designed for young people on the way up. The cost of living was remarkably low compared to the cities they had fled. A young professional could afford a new car, a nice apartment, nights out at restaurants and clubs. The weather was hot, sometimes brutally so, but air conditioning made it bearable, and there was something exhilarating about living in a place that felt like the future. The city sprawled outward across the flat Texas prairie in every direction, new developments springing up where cotton fields had stood just years before. Plano and Richardson and Garland were transforming from small towns into suburbs, their populations exploding as families sought good schools and safe neighborhoods. Highways threaded through the landscape like arteries, carrying the lifeblood of commerce and commuters, the skyline. Downtown was still relatively modest compared to what it would become. The original Neiman Marcus building anchored Commerce Street. Reunion Tower had not yet been built, but construction cranes were beginning to appear against the Texas sky, harbingers of the building boom to come. You could feel the energy, the sense that something big was happening here. The economy hummed along on multiple engines. Banking had long been important to Dallas, the city having positioned itself as a regional financial center early in its history. Insurance companies had major operations there, employing thousands in back-office operations, their headquarters buildings rising along the downtown streets. The garment industry still thrived, though it was beginning its long decline as manufacturing moved overseas. Technology companies were starting to establish presences in what would eventually become the telecom corridor, sensing opportunity in this business-friendly environment. But the real money, the serious money, came from oil. The city had positioned itself as the financial center for the oil industry across Texas and Oklahoma and beyond. While Houston handled the refineries and the physical infrastructure of petroleum, the drilling platforms in the Gulf and the pipeline networks that crisscrossed the state, Dallas handled the money. The banks, the investment deals, the financing that turned wildcatters into millionaires, the lawyers who drew up contracts and fought disputes in court, the accountants who tracked the fortunes flowing from the ground. The relationship between Dallas and oil was intimate but indirect. You would not smell refineries driving through the city as you would in Houston, where the petrochemical plants lined the ship channel and filled the air with their distinctive scent. You would not see pump jacks nodding in suburban backyards like in parts of West Texas, where the oil was so close to the surface that residential lots sometimes came with producing wells. But the wealth that flowed through the banks and law offices and corporate headquarters all traced back, ultimately, to that black gold pumping from the ground across the Permian Basin and the Panhandle, from offshore platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, from fields across Oklahoma and Louisiana. Dallas was where the deals got done, where the money changed hands, where fortunes were made and sometimes lost. And then there was the culture. Or rather, the cultures, plural, because Dallas in 1970 was a city of contradictions that somehow coexisted within the same metropolitan area. On one hand, you had old Dallas, conservative, Baptist, buttoned-up Dallas, the Dallas of country clubs and debutante balls, of oil families who had been wealthy for generations and knew exactly which fork to use at dinner. They served on the boards of the Symphony and the Art Museum. They funded the charities and set the social standards. They knew their place in the hierarchy and expected others to know theirs. This was the Dallas of Highland Park, the exclusive enclave within the city where mansions lined tree-shaded streets and old money kept to its own kind. Highland Park was its own incorporated city, completely surrounded by Dallas but fiercely independent, with its own police force and fire department, its own municipal services, its own sense of identity. The residents had incorporated as a separate city back in 1913, specifically to maintain control over their community, and they had never regretted the decision. The property values were astronomical even by Texas standards. The schools were among the best in the state, funded by that enormous property tax base and populated by children whose parents expected excellence. And the social expectations were precise enough to cut glass. If you lived in Highland Park in 1970, you knew your place in the hierarchy, and you understood the rules even if no one ever spoke them aloud. You knew which families mattered and which were new money. You knew which clubs to join and which parties to attend. You knew how to dress and how to speak and how to conduct yourself in public. The homes of Highland Park were monuments to Texas wealth, built across decades in styles that followed the fashions of each era. Georgian mansions with columns and circular driveways, their facades white or red brick, their lawns perfectly manicured. Tudor revivals with half-timbering and leaded glass windows, imported stone and authentic details. Mediterranean villas with red tile roofs and courtyard fountains, their stucco walls painted in warm creams and yellows. Spanish colonials with arched doorways and interior patios, wrought iron balconies and hand-painted tiles. The streets had names like Beverly Drive and Mockingbird Lane, and the lawns were immaculately maintained by armies of gardeners who arrived each week in trucks. The social season in Highland Park followed a precise calendar that had been established over generations. Debutante presentations introduced young women to society each fall, elaborate affairs with white gowns and formal escorts and receptions at the country club. Charity galas raised money for hospitals and museums while displaying who belonged and who was merely wealthy. The Dallas Symphony and the Dallas Museum of Art depended on these patrons for their survival. The country clubs had waiting lists years long, and membership was as much about family connections as ability to pay the fees. But there was another Dallas emerging in the 1970s, particularly in areas like the Village, a sprawling apartment complex on Greenville Avenue that had become ground zero for young professionals. Here, the rules were different. The residents were younger, more mobile, less attached to the traditions that governed Highland Park society. They had come to Dallas for jobs in banking and insurance, in the growing technology sector, in the oil companies that needed armies of white-collar workers to manage their expanding operations. They lived in efficiency apartments and one-bedrooms, with thin walls that let you hear your neighbours' arguments and romantic encounters. They shared pools and tennis courts with their neighbours, met at the mailboxes and the laundry room, formed friendships and relationships with people who had arrived just as rootless as themselves. And on the weekends, they went out. The singles scene in early 1970s Dallas was just beginning to find its feet. Bars and clubs were opening along Greenville Avenue and in pockets throughout the city, catering to this new generation of young professionals who wanted something their parents had never had: freedom. Freedom from small-town expectations, freedom from family scrutiny, freedom to reinvent themselves in a city where nobody knew their history. Oak Lawn, to the west of downtown, was quietly becoming something else entirely. The neighborhood had long been a mix of working-class families and aging Victorians divided into apartments. But by the early 70s, it was also becoming a haven for Dallas's gay community, one of the few places in this conservative city where people could be themselves, at least behind closed doors. The bars and clubs of Oak Lawn operated with a wary eye on the police, who still conducted raids and made arrests for the crime of gathering while gay. The laws against homosexuality were enforced sporadically but viciously when they were enforced. But the community was growing, finding strength in numbers, beginning to organize in ways that would eventually transform not just the neighborhood, but the entire city's politics. For now, though, discretion was the price of survival. Downtown, the original Neiman Marcus store still anchored Commerce Street, a temple to taste and sophistication, in a city that craved both. Stanley Marcus, the legendary merchant who had transformed a regional department store into a national symbol of luxury, still walked the floors, still cultivated relationships with the wealthy women who were his best customers. He knew their names, their preferences, their family histories. He understood that in Dallas, shopping was not just commerce but social ritual. Neiman Marcus was more than a store. It was a finishing school for Texas society, a place where oil wives learned what quality meant, where daughters were outfitted for their debuts, where the Christmas catalogue became an annual event that made national news with its fantasy gifts, his and hers submarines and matching airplanes. If you wanted to understand Dallas aspirations in 1970, you could do worse than spend an afternoon in the flagship Neiman Marcus store, watching the women in their careful outfits making their careful purchases, and presiding over all of it, giving Dallas its most visible identity, were the Cowboys. The Dallas Cowboys had been an expansion team born in 1960. For their first 5 years, they were terrible. The kind of team that gave fans nothing to cheer about except hope for next year. They lost and lost and lost some more, drawing sparse crowds to the Cotton Bowl, providing more material for jokes than for pride. But under coach Tom Landry, they had slowly, methodically become something special. Landry was building something systematic and lasting, a franchise built on intelligence and discipline rather than brute force. By 1970, they were contenders. They had made the playoffs, they had played in NFL championship games, but they had not yet won the big one. They were known, somewhat bitterly, as next year's champions, a team that could never quite finish what it started. They had the talent, they had the coaching. But something always went wrong at the crucial moment. That was about to change, and when it did, everything else would change too. The Cotton Bowl had been home to the Cowboys since their creation, but by the mid-1960s, owner Clint Murchison Jr. wanted out. The Cotton Bowl sat in Fair Park, the sprawling complex that hosted the annual State Fair of Texas each October. It was a perfectly good stadium, historic even, with decades of college football memories embedded in its concrete. The Texas-Oklahoma rivalry game filled it every fall, 50,000 fans split between burnt orange and crimson screaming at each other across the field. New Year's Day brought the Cotton Bowl game itself, matching top college teams in what was then one of the most prestigious postseason matchups. But Murchison saw problems that others overlooked or accepted as inevitable. The neighborhood around Fair Park had changed dramatically since the stadium was built in 1930. White flight had transformed the area as more affluent residents moved to the suburbs in the decades following World War II. The demographics had shifted. Crime statistics were rising. The facilities were aging, designed for an earlier era when expectations were lower. Concourses were cramped and dark. Restrooms were inadequate for crowds of 50,000. Parking was a nightmare of muddy fields that turned into swamps after rain. And most importantly, the Cotton Bowl did not generate the kind of revenue Murchison envisioned for a modern professional football franchise. The facility was owned by the city. The Cowboys were merely tenants, with limited ability to capture the revenue streams that would define sports economics in the coming decades. Murchison paid rent and sold tickets, but the real money, the money from concessions and parking and advertising, went to the city. Murchison came from oil money, serious oil money, and he understood business in ways that other sports owners sometimes did not. His father, Clint Murchison Sr., had been one of the great wildcatters of Texas history, a man who made hundreds of millions from the oil fields of West Texas and used that fortune to buy everything from insurance companies to publishers. The younger Murchison had inherited both the fortune and the instinct for opportunity. He had a vision for what professional football could become, a vision that went beyond the game itself. He wanted a stadium with luxury boxes, private suites where corporations and wealthy individuals would pay premium prices for the privilege of watching the game in comfort. He wanted personal seat licenses, a concept that would require fans to pay for the right to buy season tickets before they even purchased those tickets. It was revolutionary thinking for the time, ideas that seemed almost absurd when he first proposed them. He approached the city of Dallas about building a new stadium downtown as part of a broader development package that would include convention facilities and other attractions. A stadium in the city centre, Murchison argued, could anchor development and bring visitors downtown. But Mayor Eric Johnson turned him down. The politics were complicated, the financing uncertain, and downtown Dallas was not prepared to take on such an ambitious project, while other priorities competed for attention and resources. So Murchison looked elsewhere, and he found Irving. Irving was a suburb west of Dallas, a growing community of perhaps 50,000 people, eager for the attention and revenue a professional football team would bring. When Murchison and general manager Tex Schramm proposed building a new stadium there, the residents saw opportunity rather than risk. They saw their small city suddenly becoming famous, suddenly being on the map in a way it had never been before. A bond election was held in September of 1967. The residents voted overwhelmingly in favour. 2-1. They approved the measure that would bring the Cowboys to their town. Irving would provide the land and contribute to construction costs. In return, they would have the most famous stadium in Texas sitting within their city limits. Construction began in January of 1969 on a site just off the Stemmons Freeway, visible to the thousands of cars that passed daily on their commutes. The design called for something unique in American sports, a partially domed stadium. The roof would cover the stands, keeping fans protected from the brutal Texas sun and the occasional autumn rain, but would leave the playing field open to the sky. Originally, the plans had called for a fully retractable roof, a technological marvel that would allow the stadium to be fully enclosed during bad weather and open during pleasant conditions. The architects drew up elaborate plans with mechanical systems that would roll the roof sections back on tracks. It would be the most advanced stadium in the world. But the costs proved prohibitive. Engineering challenges multiplied as the architects dug deeper into the physics of moving that much material. The compromise, the fixed partial roof with its distinctive opening in the centre, became the stadium's signature feature instead. Cowboys linebacker D.D. Lewis would later deliver the quote that defined the stadium's mystique. "Texas Stadium has a hole in its roof," he said, "so God can watch his favourite team play." The quote captured something about Dallas's combination of confidence and piety, the way the city believed itself especially blessed, the way religion and football intertwined in Texas culture. The construction process was not without its challenges. Weather delays slowed progress, the Texas summer heat punishing workers and materials alike. Labor disputes required negotiation, as unions pushed for better wages on a high-profile project. The sheer complexity of the design demanded solutions that had never been attempted before in stadium construction. There were moments when observers wondered if the stadium would ever be finished, if Murchison's grand vision would remain just a vision. Costs overran initial estimates. Deadlines slipped. The Cowboys played another season in the Cotton Bowl, then another, waiting for their new home. But the owner's commitment never wavered. Murchison had bet his fortune on this project, and he intended to see it through. He had a saying, "If you have to ask how much it costs, you cannot afford it." When problems arose, he wrote checks. When complications demanded solutions, he hired experts to find them. By the fall of 1971, Texas Stadium was ready. The stadium cost $35 million to build, a staggering sum for the time, equivalent to roughly $250 million in today's currency. It seated 65,000 fans, each of whom had a clear sightline to the field. The seats were individual chairs with armrests, not the bleachers and benches of the Cotton Bowl. But the luxury boxes were the real innovation. 381 private suites ringing the stadium at various levels, far more than any stadium that had come before. Each suite was privately owned or leased, often by corporations, providing a place to entertain clients while watching the game. The suites featured private bathrooms, a luxury that sounds modest today but was remarkable in 1971. They had bars where hosts could offer drinks to their guests. They had televisions showing the game for those moments when guests were distracted by conversation and missed a play on the field. They were climate-controlled, protected from the Texas heat and cold that ordinary fans endured in the partially open stands, and the revenue from these suites was exempt from the NFL's revenue-sharing requirements, meaning the Cowboys kept all that money for themselves. While other teams split gate receipts with their opponents, the Cowboys were generating income streams that did not have to be divided with anyone. It was a business model that would transform professional sports economics. The first event held at Texas Stadium was not a football game. In September of 1971, a month before the stadium officially opened for Cowboys games, evangelist Billy Graham held a 10-day crusade there. More than 60,000 people attended each night, filling the seats to hear Graham preach in his distinctive style, mixing fire and brimstone with messages of redemption and hope. Performers like Johnny Cash and June Carter Cash took the stage, lending their celebrity to the religious gathering. The music echoed through the partially open stadium and across the parking lots. Former President Lyndon Johnson and his wife Lady Bird attended, lending their presence to the event. Graham called Texas Stadium one of the great stadiums of the world, a place fit for the gathering of believers and the proclamation of faith. The crusade set a tone for the stadium as more than just a sports venue. It was a place where important things happened, where crowds gathered for experiences that transcended ordinary entertainment. But the moment everyone had been waiting for came on October 24th, 1971. The Cowboys played their first game in their new home, facing the New England Patriots. The attendance was 65,708 souls, packed into the gleaming new stadium. The atmosphere was electric, a combination of civic pride and sporting anticipation that made the air itself seem to vibrate. This was not just a football game. This was the inauguration of a new era, the christening of a new temple. The fans arrived hours early, exploring the new facility with the excitement of children at Christmas. They marveled at the luxury boxes that looked down on the field like balconies at an opera house. They tested the sight lines from their seats, pleased to find that the angles had been designed so carefully. They found the concession stands and the restrooms, noting how much nicer everything was than the Cotton Bowl, how modern and clean and well designed. They took photographs that would become family treasures, proof that they had been there when it all began. They bought programs and pennants and souvenirs, anything that would commemorate this night. They wanted something tangible to remind them, in years to come, that they had witnessed history. 2 minutes and 16 seconds into the game, running back Dwayne Thomas took a handoff from quarterback Craig Morton. Thomas was a complicated figure, a brilliant runner with personal issues that would eventually derail his career, but on this night, he was simply magnificent. He hit the hole between his blockers and found a seam in the defense, a gap where no defender stood. He accelerated through it, his powerful legs churning against the artificial turf, his balance perfect even as tacklers reached for him. 56 yards later, he crossed into the end zone, the first touchdown in Texas Stadium history. The roar that followed was unlike anything Dallas had heard before. It echoed off the curved roof, amplified by the stadium's unique acoustics, rolling back onto itself until it became something almost physical. People screamed until their voices gave out. Strangers hugged each other, grabbed each other's arms, shouted into each other's faces. Grown men wept, tears streaming down their cheeks, overwhelmed by the moment. The energy in the stadium was physical, something you could feel pressing against your skin, vibrating in your chest. This was more than football. This was a city celebrating itself, celebrating what it had built, celebrating what it was becoming. The Cowboys won 44-21. It was a statement victory in a statement building, and it launched what would become one of the greatest eras in professional football history. The stadium's unusual design would create some challenges over the years, but mostly, Texas Stadium became exactly what Murchison and Schramm had envisioned. A cathedral of football, a place where memories were made and legends were born. The Cowboys would call it home for 37 seasons, winning championships and breaking hearts, becoming not just Dallas's team, but America's team. The stadium was demolished in 2010, replaced by the even more spectacular AT&T Stadium in Arlington. But for those who were there in the 1970s, who witnessed the birth of a dynasty in that distinctive building with its hole in the roof, Texas Stadium would always represent something magical. A time when Dallas was becoming something new, a place where dreams came true on autumn Sundays. Tom Landry stood on the sideline in his trademark fedora and sport coat, arms folded across his chest, face as unreadable as a poker player holding aces. He had been the only head coach the Cowboys had ever known, hired in 1960 when the franchise was nothing more than an idea and a roster of cast-offs from other teams. Nobody wanted to play for an expansion team in Texas, so Landry had to build with the scraps, the players other franchises did not want. For a decade, he had built something methodical and precise, a football team that ran like a well-oiled machine. Landry was a former player himself, a defensive back for the New York Giants in the early 1950s, who had shown such intelligence and understanding of the game that he moved into coaching even before his playing days ended. He was already drawing up defensive schemes for the Giants, while still wearing a uniform, his mind working on strategic levels that other players never reached. But it was as a coach that he found his genius. He invented the 4-3 defense that became the standard in professional football, 4 down linemen and 3 linebackers working in concert to stop the run and pressure the quarterback. Before Landry, defenses typically featured 5 linemen. His innovation changed how the game was played. He created the flex defense that would become the Cowboys' signature, a system where defenders were responsible for specific zones rather than simply pursuing the ball. The flex required discipline and intelligence from every player. You had to be willing to stay in your assignment even when instinct told you to chase the play, trusting that the system would work if everyone did their job. His offense was equally innovative, using multiple formations and constant motion to confuse defenders. Receivers would shift before the snap, backs would go in motion, and the quarterback might change the play at the line based on what he saw from the defense. Where other teams ran plays, Landry ran a system, one that required intelligence and discipline from every player. He was among the first coaches to use computers for scouting and game preparation, bringing a scientific approach to a sport that had often relied on intuition and brute force. While other coaches went with their gut, Landry studied printouts and analysed tendencies. He wanted to know what the other team would do before they did it. Landry himself seemed almost robotic on the sideline. He rarely showed emotion, maintaining that stoic expression whether his team was winning by 30 or losing by the same margin. He did not scream at referees or throw clipboards in frustration. He did not embrace players after victories or console them after defeats. He stood and watched, processing what he saw, making adjustments with cold precision. The players called him Coach Landry, never Tom. There was a distance between him and his team that he seemed to prefer, a professional formality that kept relationships from becoming complicated. Some players found him cold, even robotic. Others recognized that his detachment was a form of respect, treating them as professionals rather than children who needed emotional management. By 1970, the system was in place and the talent was assembled. Bob Lilly anchored the defensive line, a future Hall of Famer who could collapse a pocket or chase down a running back with equal ferocity. At 6'5" and 260 pounds, Lilly was enormous for his era, with a combination of size and speed that made him nearly impossible to block. Offensive linemen would try to get their hands on him, and he would simply swim through their arms and bury the quarterback. The Doomsday Defense, they called it, a nickname that captured both its effectiveness and its impact on opposing offenses. Lilly in the middle, George Andre and Jethro Pugh at the ends, capable of rushing the passer or setting the edge against the run. Leroy Jordan at middle linebacker, calling signals and directing traffic like a coordinator on the field. Mel Renfro and Cornell Green in the secondary, capable of covering the fastest receivers in the league or coming up to make tackles in the running game. But the Cowboys had a problem. They could not win the big games. Twice they had lost the NFL championship game to the Green Bay Packers, including the legendary Ice Bowl in 1967. That game, played in temperatures of 13 degrees below zero at Lambeau Field in Green Bay, remained a wound in the collective memory of Cowboys fans, a nightmare that played in their minds whenever the stakes were highest. The conditions were almost unimaginable for a football game. The heating system meant to keep the field thawed had failed, leaving the playing surface frozen solid as concrete. Players' breath crystallized in the air instantly, hanging in clouds before their faces. The referees' whistles froze to their lips when they tried to blow them. The cold was so severe that the Dallas band could not play their instruments because the metal mouthpieces froze and stuck to their lips, drawing blood. With 16 seconds remaining, Green Bay trailed by 2 points and faced third down at the Dallas 1-yard line. The logical play was a field goal, a chip shot that would have won the game. Instead, quarterback Bart Starr called a sneak, betting everything on one play. He pushed forward behind the block of Jerry Kramer and crossed into the end zone by inches. Dallas had lost, again, in the final seconds. The Ice Bowl became the defining moment of what the Cowboys could not do, a symbol of their inability to close out games when championships were on the line. They had made it to Super Bowl V after the 1970 season, finally reaching the biggest stage after years of falling short. But they lost to the Baltimore Colts on a last-second field goal in what some called the Blunder Bowl, for all the turnovers and mistakes on both sides. The Cowboys had committed 7 turnovers in that game, fumbles and interceptions at crucial moments. Their quarterback threw 3 interceptions. A running back fumbled deep in their own territory. The loss felt like confirmation of everything critics had said about them. Next year's champions. The label stuck, and it stung. The 1971 season began with a quarterback controversy. Craig Morton had been the starter for years, a talented passer with a strong arm but a tendency toward inconsistency. But Roger Staubach was pushing for playing time, demanding his chance to show what he could do. Staubach was different from most football players in ways that went beyond his throwing motion or his scrambling ability. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1965, winning the Heisman Trophy his junior year as the best college football player in America. He was 6 feet 3 inches of pure athletic ability, with a right arm that could thread passes through coverage and legs that could carry him away from pressure. But his commitment to the Navy meant he had to serve 4 years of active duty before he could pursue a professional career. While other players were developing in the NFL, learning the nuances of the professional game, Staubach was serving his country. He spent a year in Vietnam as a supply officer, overseeing logistics at a base in Da Nang while the war raged around him. He kept in shape as best he could, throwing footballs when he had the chance, maintaining his skills on makeshift fields while bombs fell in the distance. He came to the Cowboys at age 27, older than most rookies, having missed what should have been his prime developmental years. Some wondered if he could ever catch up, if the game had passed him by while he was serving his country. Could a quarterback learn the intricacies of professional football in his late 20s? Could he develop the instincts that other quarterbacks had honed for 4 extra years? He was also a devout Christian, a devoted family man with a wife and children, and a fierce competitor who seemed almost supernaturally driven to win. Where other quarterbacks relied on physical gifts alone, Staubach combined talent with an almost fanatical work ethic. He studied film for hours. He practiced plays until his receivers complained about fatigue. He wanted to win with an intensity that bordered on obsession. For the first half of the 1971 season, Landry alternated between his quarterbacks, trying to find the right answer. Morton would start one game, Staubach the next. Neither could establish a rhythm. Neither could feel secure in his position. In one game against the Bears, Landry actually alternated them by the play, sending in a new quarterback with each snap. Morton would hand off or throw, then trot to the sideline as Staubach ran onto the field for the next play. It was chaos, and the Cowboys lost. The crowd booed. The players were confused. The system had failed. At the midpoint of the season, Dallas was 4-3, respectable but not championship caliber, not the record of a team that expected to contend for Super Bowls, and then Landry made his decision. Staubach would be the starter. There would be no more alternating, no more controversy, no more questions about who would take the snaps. Roger Staubach was the quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys, and that was final. Dallas did not lose another game that season. 7 straight victories to close out the regular season, each one building on the last, each one adding to the sense that something special was happening. Staubach grew more comfortable with each game, more confident, more deadly. He was learning the NFL at an accelerated pace, his intelligence compensating for his lost years. His passer rating for the season was an extraordinary 104.8, the best in the NFL by a significant margin. He threw 15 touchdowns against only 4 interceptions, protecting the ball with discipline while still making the aggressive throws. He made plays that seemed impossible, scrambling away from pressure and finding open receivers downfield, extending plays with his legs and finishing them with his arm. A playoff win over the Minnesota Vikings, another win over the San Francisco 49ers for the NFC Championship, and then Super Bowl VI against the Miami Dolphins. The game was played in New Orleans on January 16th, 1972. Tulane Stadium, with its ancient grandstands and grass field, hosted what would become one of the most dominant performances in Super Bowl history. Miami was young and talented, coached by Don Shula, with a roster that would go undefeated the following year in one of the greatest seasons any team has ever played. They had a powerful running game led by Larry Sonka and Jim Kick. They had a defense that had carried them through the playoffs. But on this day, they had no answer for Dallas. The Cowboys dominated from start to finish, executing Landry's game plan with precision that bordered on artistic. Their running game accumulated 252 yards, a Super Bowl record at the time. Dwayne Thomas rushed for 95 of those yards, his powerful style grinding down the Miami defense as the game wore on, his legs never seeming to tire. Walt Garrison added 74 more, his blue-collar style perfectly suited to Landry's methodical approach. Staubach threw for 2 touchdowns and was named the game's most valuable player. He was calm under pressure, making the throws when they mattered, managing the game with a veteran's poise despite his relative inexperience. The Doomsday defense held Miami to 3 points, the fewest ever scored by a team in a Super Bowl up to that time. The Dolphins' vaunted running game managed only 80 yards, stuffed at the line again and again by Lilly and his teammates. Final score, Dallas 24, Miami 3. Tom Landry was carried off the field on the shoulders of his players, and for once, for just that moment, a smile cracked his stoic facade. The fedora tilted on his head, his arms rose in celebration. 20 years of building, of losing, of being told his team could not win the big one, and now they had won the biggest one of all. The next year's champion's curse was broken. The Dallas Cowboys were champions of the world. It was only the beginning. Throughout the 1970s, the Cowboys remained at or near the top of professional football, a sustained excellence that no other team could match. They returned to the Super Bowl after the 1975 season, losing a heartbreaker to the Pittsburgh Steelers, 21-17. That game featured one of the most famous plays in NFL history. Lynn Swann's acrobatic catch over Mark Washington, where the Steelers' receiver seemed to float through the air and somehow hold onto the ball despite impossible coverage. Swann twisted and turned, the ball dancing on his fingertips, and when he came down with it, the Cowboys' hopes came down too. They went back again after the 1977 season, this time crushing the Denver Broncos 27-10 to claim their second championship of the decade. Harvey Martin and Randy White, the defensive ends who had terrorized opposing quarterbacks all season, shared Most Valuable Player honors, the only time that award has been split, in Super Bowl history. And then came another Super Bowl loss to Pittsburgh after the 1978 season, a game that went down to the final minutes, 35-31, in a contest that many still consider one of the greatest Super Bowls ever played. Pittsburgh and Dallas traded haymakers for 4 quarters, neither team able to put the other away, until the final seconds ticked away, and the Steelers held on. 5 Super Bowl appearances in 9 years, 2 championships, a decade of dominance that transformed the franchise from regional attraction to national phenomenon. The Cowboys were on national television more than any other team in football. Their games drew the highest ratings, their stars became celebrities recognized far beyond the sports pages, household names in homes that did not even care about football, and somewhere along the way, they acquired a nickname that would define them forever. America's Team. The name came from a highlight film produced by NFL Films in 1978. The narrator, the legendary voice of John Facenda, noted how Cowboys fans seemed to appear everywhere the team played, filling visiting stadiums with their cheers. No matter where the Cowboys went, he said, whether to Washington or New York, Philadelphia or Chicago, there were fans waiting for them, fans wearing the star, fans cheering for Dallas. The Cowboys, he concluded in that sonorous voice, were America's team. Landry did not like the label. He thought it would motivate opponents, give them extra incentive to beat Dallas, turn every game into a crusade against presumption. And he was probably right. Other teams' fans resented the presumption, the arrogance of claiming to represent all of America, of assuming their team was somehow special. but the name stuck because it captured something true. The Cowboys had become more than just a football team from Texas. They had become a symbol of success, of excellence, of a certain kind of American glamour that transcended regional loyalties. When people around the world thought of American football, they thought of the star on the helmet. They thought of Tom Landry in his fedora. They thought of Roger Staubach throwing from the pocket. The players of that era became legends, their names still invoked decades later by fans who remember their glory days. Staubach, the Navy hero who won 2 Super Bowls and earned a reputation for impossible comebacks. He would lead the Cowboys to 23 fourth-quarter comeback victories in his career, so many that the phenomenon earned its own name, Captain Comeback. Tony Dorsett arrived in 1977, the explosive running back from Pittsburgh who won a championship his rookie year. Dorsett could accelerate through holes that other runners would not even see, his quickness making tacklers grasp at air where he had been a moment before. He was poetry and shoulder pads, grace and power combined. Randy White and Harvey Martin, the defensive ends who terrorized quarterbacks. Ed Too Tall Jones, who stood 6 feet 9 inches tall and could have been a basketball star or a boxer but chose football, his wingspan making him impossible to throw over. Cliff Harris and Charlie Waters, the safeties who hit like linebackers and read quarterbacks like they were stealing the signals. Drew Pearson, who caught Staubach's Hail Mary passes and made the impossible seem routine. These names meant something to a generation of football fans, symbols of an era when the Cowboys stood atop the sport. And the team they played for helped transform Dallas from a city known for tragedy into a city known for triumph. Before 1972, cheerleaders in professional football were an afterthought. Most teams had squads of local high school girls or college students who led chants and waved pom-poms during timeouts. They wore modest sweaters with their team's letters. They performed traditional cheers that their grandmothers would have recognized. They were wholesome, traditional, and largely invisible on television broadcasts. The Dallas Cowboys had a group called the Cowbells and Beaux, a co-ed squad that did exactly what cheerleaders had always done. They performed traditional cheers. They encouraged fans to make noise. They were fine, adequate, forgettable, and then came Bubbles Cash. In 1967, during a game at the Cotton Bowl, a woman named Bubbles Cash walked down the stand staircase on the 50-yard line. Her real name was not Bubbles, of course, but she had earned the nickname for reasons that were immediately apparent. She was, to use the parlance of the time, generously proportioned, and she was wearing a short skirt that drew attention with every step. She carried cotton candy in each hand, one in each manicured fist, and she walked with a sway that suggested she knew exactly the effect she was having on the predominantly male crowd. The crowd went wild. Players on the field lost focus as their eyes followed her progress down the stairs. Television cameras swung to follow her, the directors recognizing a story when they saw one. For a few minutes, Bubbles Cash was the most interesting thing happening at the Cotton Bowl, more captivating than the game itself. Tex Schramm, the Cowboys' general manager, took notice from his position in the press box. Schramm understood entertainment in ways that other sports executives sometimes did not. He had worked in television before joining the Cowboys, had produced the 1960 Winter Olympics for CBS. He understood marketing, he understood spectacle, and he understood that Bubbles Cash had accidentally revealed something important about what fans wanted to see. It took a few years for the vision to crystallize, but by 1972, Schramm was ready to revolutionize professional cheerleading. He charged a woman named Dee Brock with developing something new, a squad of adult women, professional dancers, who would perform choreographed routines rather than traditional cheers. Brock understood the assignment. This would not be a squad of enthusiastic amateurs learning routines in their spare time. This would be a professional entertainment product, as polished and precise as anything on Broadway. She recruited Texie Waterman, one of the top dance instructors in America, to serve as choreographer. Waterman had trained dancers for Broadway and Hollywood. She knew how to create routines that were athletic, visually stunning, and perfectly synchronized. She knew how to make movement tell a story, how to use bodies as instruments of expression. Together, they auditioned over 100 women and selected just 7 to form the inaugural squad of what would become the Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders. The auditions were rigorous, testing not just dancing ability but athleticism, personality, and that ineffable quality that made certain women captivating to watch. They were looking for something specific, something that transcended mere beauty or mere talent. These were not high school girls learning their first dance steps. These were adult women, many with years of dance training, who brought professional discipline to their performances. They practiced for hours every week. They learned routines that would make Broadway choreographers nod in appreciation. They were athletes in their own right, their bodies conditioned for the physical demands of performance. But they needed more than just dancers. They needed a look. Paula Van Wagener was a fashion designer in Dallas who got the assignment through a connection. Her boss played golf with Tex Schramm, and when Schramm mentioned he needed someone to design uniforms for a new cheerleading squad, Van Wagener got the call. The requirements were specific and sometimes contradictory. The uniform had to allow for movement, for the athletic dance routines Waterman was creating. It had to have a country theme, something that said Texas and Western heritage, and it had to be, in the carefully chosen words of the time, attractive while remaining tasteful, sexy but not trashy, revealing but not vulgar. It was a fine line to walk. Van Wagener presented two options. One was a fringe belt worn over a bodysuit, which looked more like something from a costume shop than a professional uniform. It was too literal, too obvious in its Western references. The other was what would become the most famous cheerleading uniform in history, a tied-off blue blouse that showed a strip of midriff, a vest with white stars, white shorts that would later be called hot pants, and white go-go boots that climbed up the calf. They chose the blouse and shorts, and professional sports would never be the same. The new Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders made their debut at Texas Stadium for the 1972 season. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fans cheered louder for the cheerleaders than they had for any squad before. Mail poured into the Cowboys' offices, much of it from men requesting photographs, but also from women asking how to try out for the squad. The cheerleaders transformed the game day experience in ways that went beyond their routines. Where traditional squads had stood on the sidelines waving pom-poms, the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders performed. They executed jazz-inspired dance routines with precision timing, their movements synchronized down to the smallest gesture. They smiled with practiced warmth at the cameras, aware that millions of viewers at home were watching. They became part of the show, as much an attraction as the football itself. But the moment that launched the cheerleaders into national consciousness came on January 18th, 1976, at Super Bowl X in Miami. CBS, broadcasting the game, made a decision to feature the cheerleaders prominently in their coverage. The camera cut to them during breaks in the action, during timeouts, during any pause in play. The directors understood what Schramm had understood. These women were compelling television, and at one key moment a cheerleader named Gwenda Swearingen winked at the camera. It was a small gesture, lasting perhaps a second. Just a wink, a flirtatious acknowledgement that she knew the camera was watching, that she was performing for an audience beyond the stadium. But that wink was seen by 80 million people watching at home. The switchboard at CBS lit up with calls. Newspapers ran stories the next day not just about the game, which Dallas lost to Pittsburgh, but about those women on the sideline. The honey shots, they came to call them, and they became a staple of football broadcasts for years afterward. Other networks copied the approach. Other teams created their own cheerleading squads. But the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders remained the standard against which all others were measured. By 1977, the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders were a phenomenon unto themselves, famous beyond their association with the football team. They released a poster that became one of the best-selling posters in history, outsold only by images of Farrah Fawcett and a few other icons of the era. The poster showed the cheerleaders arranged in formation, their smiles dazzling, their uniforms instantly recognizable. It hung on dorm room walls and locker room doors across America. They appeared on the cover of Esquire magazine, their image declaring that Dallas was no longer just a city in Texas, but a national phenomenon. They starred in television specials, including one called The 36 Most Beautiful Girls in Texas, that drew enormous ratings. In 1979, a television movie called Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders aired on ABC and drew massive ratings. Jane Seymour starred as a reporter who goes undercover to expose the squad's secrets. The movie was melodrama dressed as exposé, full of rivalries and romances and behind-the-scenes drama. But audiences did not care about cinematic quality. They wanted to see the cheerleaders, and 24 million households tuned in to watch. A sequel followed the next year to similar success. Suzanne Mitchell took over as director of the cheerleaders in 1976, and she ran the operation with an iron fist wrapped in Southern charm. She'd started as Tex Schramm's secretary, answering phones and typing letters in the Cowboys' front office. When he asked her what she wanted to be doing in 5 years, she had pointed at his chair and said it looked comfortable. Mitchell instituted strict rules that became legendary in the cheerleading world. The cheerleaders were not allowed to fraternize with players under any circumstances. If a cheerleader was seen in the same restaurant as a player, she faced discipline. If she dated one, she was dismissed. The fantasy had to remain untouchable. They had strict weight requirements, regularly weighed at practice. If a cheerleader gained more than a few pounds, she was put on probation. If the weight did not come off, she was removed from the squad. The standards were precise and unforgiving. Their conduct off the field was monitored, dating was restricted, public behaviour was scrutinised. They were to be fantasy figures, approachable in theory but untouchable in practice. The image was as important as the performance. But Mitchell also protected them fiercely, understanding that exploitation was always a risk when young women were commodified. She fought to get them better pay, arguing with team ownership that the cheerleaders generated revenue and deserved to share in it. She threatened lawsuits against anyone who tried to exploit their image without permission, pursuing unauthorized calendars and merchandise with legal action. When an adult film company tried to use a knockoff version of the uniform for a pornographic production, Mitchell pursued legal action that eventually led to injunctions against the film's distribution. The uniform was trademarked. The image was protected. The cheerleaders belonged to the Cowboys organization, not to anyone who wanted to borrow their appeal. The impact extended far beyond Dallas. Other NFL teams scrambled to create similar squads, redesigning their cheerleading programs to copy what Dallas had created. Some called it the cheerleading war of 1978, as franchises across the league tried to replicate the Cowboys' success with their own attractive dancers in revealing uniforms. The cheerleaders became international ambassadors for the Dallas Cowboys brand. Beginning in 1979, they went on USO tours to perform for American troops stationed overseas, traveling to bases around the world to bring entertainment to soldiers far from home. They traveled to South Korea for that first holiday tour and would continue the tradition for decades, maintaining a connection between the Cowboys and the American military. The cultural impact was complex and continues to be debated decades later. Critics saw the cheerleaders as objectification, as a reduction of women to their physical appearance in service of male entertainment. The uniforms were revealing by design. The camera lingered on bodies. The entire enterprise seemed designed to satisfy male desires while reducing women to decorative elements. Supporters saw empowerment, women owning their sexuality and athletic abilities, earning money and fame on their own terms. The cheerleaders were paid, though not well by professional standards. They were celebrated, their faces and names known to millions. They had agency in a way that previous generations of women in entertainment often lacked, choosing to perform rather than being forced into it. Many went on to careers in dance, entertainment, and business, using their time on the squad as a launching pad. What is undeniable is the influence. In 2018, the original Dallas Cowboys Cheerleaders uniform was added to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History collection, a permanent symbol of its impact on popular culture. The uniform that Paula Van Wagoner had designed in her Dallas studio now sits alongside the Constitution and the Star-Spangled Banner. The cheerleaders had done something remarkable. They had helped transform Dallas's image from the city where Kennedy was killed to the city of America's team and America's sweethearts. It was a rebranding exercise that public relations firms would study for generations, accomplished not through advertising campaigns but through entertainment that people actually wanted to watch. In October of 1973, war broke out in the Middle East. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, and the conflict quickly drew in the superpowers. The Soviet Union supported the Arab states, the United States supported Israel. For a few tense weeks, some feared the regional conflict might escalate into something much worse. When the United States provided military support to Israel, the Arab members of OPEC responded with an oil embargo. They would not sell petroleum to nations that supported their enemy. The tap was turned off, and the world suddenly remembered how dependent it had become on oil. For most of America, the embargo was a disaster. Gas stations ran dry. Lines stretched for blocks in cities across the country, cars waiting hours for the chance to fill their tanks. The price of gasoline doubled and then doubled again. Prices for everything from food to electricity climbed as the cost of energy rippled through every sector of the economy. The American way of life, built on cheap energy and unlimited mobility, suddenly seemed fragile. People carpooled, they turned down their thermostats, they sold their gas-guzzling sedans for smaller imports. The economy stumbled into recession, unemployment rose, inflation accelerated. A nation that had taken cheap energy for granted suddenly found itself at the mercy of foreign producers, and the realization was deeply unsettling. But in Texas, the crisis was a bonanza. Oil that had sold for $3.89 a barrel before the embargo jumped to $12.51. Texas wells that had been marginally profitable, barely worth the cost of pumping, suddenly gushed money. Stripper wells that produced only a few barrels a day became valuable again. Fields that had been abandoned as uneconomical were reopened and put back into production. Wildcatters who had been scraping by, always one dry hole away from bankruptcy, found themselves wealthy beyond imagination overnight. Their existing production was suddenly worth 3 times what it had been. Their proven reserves were suddenly worth fortunes, and the price kept climbing, and Dallas, the financial center of the Texas oil industry, caught the flood of cash. The city had positioned itself perfectly over the previous decades. While Houston handled the physical infrastructure of petroleum, the refineries that turned crude into gasoline and the pipelines that carried it across the continent, Dallas handled the money, the banks that financed drilling operations, the lawyers who drew up contracts and fought over royalties, the accountants who managed the books and minimized taxes, the investors who provided capital for new ventures. Suddenly all of those services were in demand like never before. Every oil company needed more financing to drill more wells. Every successful driller needed lawyers to handle the suddenly complex deals. Every newly wealthy wildcatter needed accountants to help them understand their sudden fortune and protect it from the taxman. The stories of overnight wealth became legendary, told and retold in Dallas bars and country clubs until the truth became indistinguishable from embellishment. A roughneck who had worked the oil fields for years, coming home exhausted and covered in crude, would discover a productive well on a piece of land he had leased for almost nothing. Within months, he would be driving a Mercedes, living in a mansion in Preston Hollow, buying drinks for everyone at the country club that had once considered him too low class for membership. A secretary who had taken stock in the company where she worked, accepting shares instead of higher wages because she believed in her boss, would find her portfolio worth a fortune when the company struck oil. She could retire at 35, travel the world, never work another day if she chose. A farmer in West Texas who had never cared about the mineral rights beneath his land, who had signed them away years before for a pittance just to pay off a tractor, would watch as the buyer became a millionaire from what lay beneath his fields. The regret would haunt him, but there was always another chance, another lease, another opportunity to strike it. Rich. The banks could not lend money fast enough. They would give loans to anyone with a plausible claim to oil rights, trusting that the rising prices would guarantee repayment. A piece of land with geological surveys suggesting oil underneath? Here is a loan. A partnership share in a drilling operation? Here is a loan. An existing well that might produce for another decade? Here is a loan. Due diligence became an afterthought. If oil kept climbing, any investment would pay off. The deals were done on handshakes and confidence, the paperwork catching up later. It was a calculated risk that seemed brilliant when oil kept climbing. It would prove catastrophic when it eventually stopped. But through the 1970s, it only climbed. Oil reached $20 a barrel, then $30. By 1980, it would touch $40. Every increase sent more money flowing through Dallas, more deposits into the banks, more deals across the lawyers' desks, more Mercedes in the parking lots. The real estate market caught fire. With so much money looking for somewhere to go, investors poured capital into development. Shopping centres sprouted on every major intersection, their parking lots designed for thousands of cars. Office towers rose downtown, each one taller and more ambitious than the last. Apartment complexes spread across the suburbs, housing the workers who flooded into the city. Master-planned communities sprouted on former farmland at the edges of the metroplex, their streets named for trees that had been bulldozed to make room. The downtown skyline began its transformation from modest to spectacular. Construction cranes became as common as birds against the Texas sky, their mechanical arms swinging loads of steel and concrete into place. Buildings rose, each one trying to outdo the last. The old 2- and 3-story Dallas of the mid-century was disappearing, replaced by a forest of glass and steel that proclaimed the city's ambition to the world. The excess became its own kind of entertainment, fodder for newspapers and magazines that documented the outrageous ways newly rich Texans spent their money. A man who bought matching his and hers Rolls-Royces for himself and his wife, the cars sitting in a garage that cost more than most people's houses. A woman who had her swimming pool shaped like the state of Texas, complete with a jacuzzi where Galveston would be on the map. A rancher who flew his helicopter to lunch because driving took too long, landing in the restaurant parking lot while diners watched through the windows. In Houston, the helicopter commute became genuinely common among the wealthy. The morning traffic on the freeways grew so congested that executives would rather lift off from their backyards than sit in their Mercedes going nowhere. The noise became such a problem in certain neighborhoods that residents filed complaints with City Hall, leading to one of the stranger municipal debates of the era: how to regulate helicopter traffic in residential areas. Dallas was slightly more restrained, but only slightly. The old money in Highland Park looked down on the new money with its flashy spending and garish tastes. The nouveau riche did not know how to behave, the Highland Park matriarchs whispered over lunch at the Zodiac Room. They confused having money with having class. They thought a Rolls-Royce made them respectable, but the new money did not care what Highland Park thought. They had proved something. They had beaten the odds, struck it rich, lived the American dream. If they wanted to show it off with gold-plated bathroom fixtures and diamond-encrusted watches and custom cowboy boots with their initials worked into the leather, who could blame them? They had earned it, or at least gotten lucky enough to claim it. The Cowboys' ownership reflected this oil wealth perfectly. Clint Murchison Jr., who had built Texas Stadium and assembled the team that won 2 Super Bowls, came from one of Texas's great oil fortunes. His father, Clint Murchison Sr., had been one of the legendary wildcatters of Texas history, a man who made hundreds of millions from the oil fields of West Texas, turning a series of lucky strikes and shrewd deals into a family empire that stretched across industries. The younger Murchison had inherited both the fortune and the instinct for opportunity. He saw the Cowboys not just as a sports team but as an entertainment property, a brand that could be leveraged into multiple revenue streams. He invested in the team with the same calculated aggression his father had applied to oil fields. The connection between oil and football was not coincidental. The Cowboys' success gave Dallas a glamorous public face, a reason for the nation to pay attention to this boomtown on the prairie. And the oil money funded expansions, improvements, marketing campaigns that spread the Cowboys' brand across the country. Few people in 1975 or 1978 imagined that the boom would ever end. Oil prices would keep rising. The buildings would keep going up. The money would keep flowing. Dallas was on its way to becoming one of the great cities of America, and nothing could stop it. They were wrong, of course. The bust would come in the mid-1980s, and it would be devastating. Oil prices would collapse as new supplies came online from around the world and OPEC's unity fractured. Banks would fail by the dozens, their loan portfolios revealed as worthless when the collateral evaporated. Fortunes would evaporate overnight. The gleaming office towers would empty out, their marble lobbies echoing with the footsteps of security guards making their rounds through abandoned floors. But that's a story for another night. In the 1970s, the party was just getting started. Stanley Marcus was 70 years old in 1975 when he finally stepped back from day-to-day management of the store his aunt had co-founded with his father and uncle in 1907. But his influence on Dallas and on the concept of luxury retail would outlast him by decades. Neiman Marcus was not just a department store. It was a finishing school for Texas society, a temple of taste in a state that outsiders often dismissed as crude and provincial, a place where oil money learned what quality meant. From its flagship location on Commerce Street downtown, the store taught generations of wealthy Texans the difference between expensive and good, between showy and elegant. Stanley Marcus had taken over from his father in 1950 and transformed the store into something remarkable, something that transcended regional retail to become a national symbol of luxury. He cultivated relationships with designers, bringing Christian Dior to Dallas for the designer's first American visit in 1947. The fashion world was astonished that the legendary French designer would travel to Texas of all places, but Marcus understood something others did not. Texas had money, and Texas money wanted to be told what to buy. He created the fortnight celebrations, 2-week extravaganzas that brought the culture of different countries to Dallas through fashion shows, cultural exhibitions, and lavish parties. When a country was honored, the entire store was transformed. Merchandise was imported, entertainers were flown in. The effect was like traveling abroad without leaving downtown Dallas. The fortnights became the social events of the Dallas calendar, occasions that drew participation from every level of society that considered itself cultured. When Great Britain was honoured in the early 1970s, society women bought entire wardrobes for the various parties and events. Bagpipers performed at galas. Dignitaries flew in from London. The store was transformed into a showcase of British culture, complete with imported merchandise and staff members affecting British accents. Princess Grace of Monaco attended a Neiman Marcus gala in 1971, lending her Hollywood meets royalty glamour to the Dallas social scene. She was the height of elegance, a movie star who had become actual royalty, and her presence validated Dallas's aspirations to sophistication. Oscar de la Renta was a frequent visitor in the early 70s, cultivating clients among the wealthy women who shopped there. Karl Lagerfeld came to Dallas in 1978 for a party in his honor, surrounded by admirers who hung on his every pronouncement about style. The Christmas catalogue had become a national phenomenon by the 1970s, anticipated not just by shoppers but by journalists and commentators who wondered what outrageous gift would appear. Each year, Neiman Marcus would include fantasy gifts, extravagant items that were as much about generating publicity as generating sales. His and hers submarines, matching mummy cases guaranteed authentic with certificates of provenance, a Black Angus steer with a year's supply of beef included, delivered dressed and butchered to your specifications, an entire junk from Hong Kong, sailed across the Pacific by a professional crew, a real airplane painted in the customer's choice of colours. The catalogue became an annual event, covered by newspapers and television shows across the country, wondering what outrageous gift would appear next. Most of the fantasy items were never purchased, but that was beside the point. They generated attention, kept Neiman Marcus in the public consciousness, reminded everyone that this was not an ordinary store. But the store's influence went beyond spectacle. In 1973, Neiman Marcus gave its prestigious fashion award to Levi Strauss, declaring denim the single most important American contribution to worldwide fashion. It was a remarkable statement from a store known for couture gowns and designer labels, an acknowledgement that fashion was changing in fundamental ways. The award recognized what was happening on the streets, where the rigid dress codes of previous generations were dissolving. Blue jeans had moved from workwear to universal garment, worn by everyone from factory workers to college students, to wealthy women who paired them with silk blouses and expensive jewellery. And fashion was changing dramatically in the 1970s, more rapidly than at almost any time in history. The formal structures that had governed dress for decades were loosening, sometimes collapsing entirely. Women who had worn girdles and stockings to the grocery store in the 50s now wore jeans and went braless. Men who had never left the house without a tie experimented with open collars and gold chains. The rules that had seemed permanent were revealed as merely conventional. Dallas embraced the changes with typical Texas enthusiasm, which is to say, bigger and bolder. If the trend was platform shoes, Dallas women wanted the highest platforms, 4 inches of cork or wood lifting them toward the sky. If the style was sequins, Dallas wanted more sequins than anyone else, dresses that glittered and shone under the disco ball. If jewellery was in fashion, Dallas women wore it in quantities that would make a Manhattan socialite blanch, gold and diamonds dripping from ears and necks and wrists. The disco era arrived in Dallas in the mid-70s, bringing with it a new aesthetic that seemed designed for Dallas sensibilities. Shiny fabrics that caught the light, metallic golds and silvers that glittered on the dance floor, halter tops and hot pants that showed more skin than previous generations would have tolerated in public. Bell-bottoms so wide they swept the ground as you walked, requiring careful attention to puddles and stairs. For men, the transformation was equally dramatic. The narrow lapels and conservative suits of the early decade gave way to wider and wider cuts, the fashion pendulum swinging toward excess. Shirt collars grew enormous, meant to be worn open and spread over the lapels of sport coats. Polyester blends in bright colours replaced the wool and cotton of previous generations, their synthetic sheen matching the synthetic quality of the era. The Zodiac Room at Neiman Marcus remained a temple of ladies who lunch, where wealthy women gathered over chicken salad and the famous popovers to discuss philanthropy and social obligations. The room featured astrological symbols on the walls, a touch of whimsy in an otherwise elegant setting. But even there the changes were visible. Younger women dressed more casually than their mothers had. The rigid rules of gloves and hats for shopping trips were relaxing. A new informality was creeping into even the most traditional spaces, the generational shift evident in hemlines and hairstyles. Stanley Marcus watched these changes with a mixture of interest and concern. He believed in quality, in craftsmanship, in things that lasted. The disposable fashion of the disco era troubled him, but he was pragmatist enough to know that the store had to evolve with its customers, that resistance to change was commercial suicide. The Village apartment sprawled across Greenville Avenue in northeast Dallas, a complex of buildings and pools and tennis courts that had become ground zero for the city's young professional scene. If you wanted to understand 1970s Dallas, you could do worse than spend a Saturday night in the Village. If you were 25 years old in 1975 and you had moved to Dallas for a job in banking or insurance or oil, the Village was where you lived. The apartments were not fancy. Efficiency units and one-bedrooms with thin walls that let you hear your neighbours' arguments and romantic encounters. The finishes were basic, the appliances utilitarian. But the complex had something more valuable than square footage: community. Thousands of young people lived there, all of them in roughly the same situation, all of them new to Dallas, all of them looking for connection in a city where they knew almost no one. The pools became gathering places on summer weekends, where young men and women sized each other up over coolers of beer. The tennis courts hosted pickup games that were as much about flirting as athleticism. The laundry rooms were places to meet your neighbours, and on Friday and Saturday nights, the residents of the Village went out. They dressed in the fashions of the era, the women in halter tops and tight jeans, the men in polyester shirts open at the collar, everyone smelling of cologne and possibility. The clubs and bars of 1970s Dallas were scattered across the city, but many clustered along Greenville Avenue, convenient to the apartment complexes where their customers lived. TGF Fridays in Old Town was a pioneer of the singles bar concept, a place where young professionals gathered after work for drinks and possibility. The first TGI Fridays actually opened in New York in 1965, but the Dallas location became a phenomenon of its own, packed night after night with young people looking for fun. The formula was simple: a relaxed atmosphere, affordable drinks, and a clientele of young single professionals looking to meet each other. No pretension, no dress code beyond basic decency, no judgment, just possibility. Other clubs proliferated along Greenville Avenue and throughout the city, their names changing as establishments opened and closed with the rhythm of fashion. What was hot one year was empty the next. New places opened with new names and new themes, hoping to capture lightning in a bottle. The scene remained constant even as the specific venues shifted. In 1973, the Texas legislature lowered the drinking age to 18. Suddenly, college students could legally drink, and even recent high school graduates could walk into bars without fake IDs. Combined with laws that allowed drivers to have open containers in their vehicles, as long as they were not intoxicated, it created an atmosphere of remarkable permissiveness. You could finish work at 5 o'clock, walk to a bar, drink until midnight, and drive home with a beer in your cup holder. As long as you were not visibly drunk, weaving across lanes or slurring your words to a police officer, you would face no consequences. The concept of designated drivers was years away. The harsh penalties for driving while intoxicated would not come until the 1980s, after too many tragedies made the permissive approach untenable. The most exclusive club in late 70s Dallas was probably Elan, a private membership establishment near Lovers Lane and Greenville Avenue. Membership cost $350 a year, roughly twice what you might pay for rent on an efficiency apartment. But for that price, you got access to a world of upscale sophistication. Elan was famous for its theme parties, events that gave guests an excuse to dress up and show off. The Tax Day Bash in April invited guests to dress according to their tax returns. If you'd received a large refund, you came dressed in riches, women wearing fake jewellery dripping from their necks, men in suits made of play money. If you owed taxes, you came dressed in rags, playing the part of the overtaxed citizen. The parties could get wild, but they were curated wild. The controlled chaos of young professionals blowing off steam after weeks of work. Everyone there had jobs, had ambitions, had reputations to protect. They just also wanted to have fun. The drug culture that emerged in this nightlife scene reflected the wider trends of the era. Marijuana was everywhere, passed around at parties and smoked in parking lots before going into clubs. The smell was as common as cigarette smoke in certain venues. Chocolate and strawberry mescaline circulated at parties. The hallucinogens, promising insights and adventures, nitrous oxide, provided quick highs. Balloons full of the gas passed from person to person. Quaaludes, the sedative that became the party drug of the decade, were passed around like candy. And then there was cocaine. Cocaine burst onto the Dallas scene in the mid-70s, finding its way into every niche of society with remarkable speed. From Highland Park mansions to industrial district clubs, from oil company executive suites to young professional apartments, the white powder became ubiquitous. It seemed like everyone was doing it, or at least everyone who considered themselves sophisticated. It was expensive, which made it a status symbol. If you could afford cocaine, you were successful. You had money. You had connections. You were part of the scene that mattered. The drug became a marker of belonging, a way of signaling that you had arrived. It was energizing, which made it perfect for a city that valued hustle and ambition. Dallas rewarded hard work and long hours. Cocaine let you work longer, party harder, push through the fatigue that might have stopped you otherwise. In a city where getting ahead meant outworking your competitors, anything that gave you an edge was valuable. And it was, for a few years at least, legal enough to possess in small amounts that users faced minimal consequences. The penalties for cocaine possession were far lighter than they would become in the 80s and 90s. Getting caught with a small amount might mean a fine, maybe probation, but rarely jail time. The risk seemed manageable. The culture of the disco era embraced the drug. The long nights of dancing required energy that alcohol alone could not provide. The Studio 54 aesthetic of glamour and excess practically demanded chemical assistance. And in Dallas, where everything was bigger, the cocaine use was bigger too. Not everyone participated, of course. Conservative Dallas, Baptist Dallas, Church on Sunday Dallas still existed and still represented the majority of the population. Most people in Dallas never went to Elon or the village parties, never tried cocaine, never participated in the excesses that would later define the era in popular memory. They went to work and went to church and raised their children and lived lives that would not make for interesting stories. But for those who wanted to party, Dallas in the 1970s offered opportunities that their parents could never have imagined. The permissive laws, the influx of money, the population of young professionals hungry for experience, it all combined to create something unprecedented. The live music scene in 1970s Dallas was extraordinary, though it is largely forgotten today. If you wanted to see a band, any band, Dallas was one of the best places in America to be. The reason was economics. Record companies required their artists to tour, to promote albums through live performances. And Dallas-Fort Worth was simply too big a market to skip. Every national act that wanted to sell records in Texas had to play Dallas. And the competition for venues meant that prices stayed low and quality stayed high. You could see a major rock concert for $5. $5. The equivalent of perhaps $20 or $25 today, but still a fraction of what concerts would cost in later decades. The economic model was simple. Artists went on tour to sell records. The concert itself was advertising, a way to generate excitement and word of mouth. The real money came from album sales, from the vinyl records and 8-track tapes that fans would buy after seeing the show. The arena shows drew the biggest names: Aerosmith and Led Zeppelin, the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac. These acts filled stadiums and convention centres, thousands of fans packing in to see rock and roll performed at full volume. The energy at these shows was electric, the crowds singing along to every word, lighters held aloft during ballads, the entire venue united in shared experience. Mother Blues on Lemon Avenue became legendary among Dallas music fans for more intimate shows. The club hosted acts that would later become icons, in settings where the audience was close enough to touch the performers. The venue had maybe a few hundred seats, meaning that you could watch future legends in a room where everyone felt close to the stage, where the sweat from the performers was visible, where the music felt personal rather than distant. Buddy magazine chronicled the scene with enthusiasm and attitude. The publication was named after Buddy Holly, the Texas rock and roll pioneer who had died in a plane crash in 1959. As its founder put it, Buddy Holly changed his life. The magazine covered the local music scene, profiling bands and reviewing concerts, arguing about which artists were authentic and which were selling out. The radio stations of the era shaped the music scene in ways that would be impossible in later decades of corporate consolidation. Kazoo, known as The Zoo, was an FM rock powerhouse that introduced Dallas listeners to progressive and album-oriented rock. The DJs had freedom to play what they liked, to break new artists, to shape musical tastes according to their own judgment rather than corporate playlists. Record stores were community gathering places, not just retail establishments. You would go to Sound Warehouse or Peaches not just to buy albums but to browse, to discover, to talk with the staff about what was new and interesting. The employees were often musicians themselves or at least serious fans, and they could steer you toward albums you would never have found on your own. These conversations shaped tastes and built communities. One of the most legendary concerts in Dallas history took place on January 10th, 1978, when the Sex Pistols played the Longhorn Ballroom. The venue was an unlikely choice. The Longhorn had been built by Texas swing legend Bob Wills and had hosted country and western acts for decades. Its stage had seen the greatest names in country music, artists who embodied tradition and craftsmanship, and now it was hosting punk rock, the aggressive, confrontational music that seemed designed to destroy everything country music represented. The band was on their only American tour, a 12-day exercise in barely controlled chaos. Manager Malcolm McLaren had deliberately booked them into venues in the South and Southwest, away from the major media markets of New York and Los Angeles, hoping that the culture clash would generate controversy and attention. The Dallas show delivered on that promise. The audience was a mix of punk fans who had read about the movement in imported British magazines, curious locals who wanted to see what the fuss was about, and country music regulars who had wandered in not knowing what awaited them. Tension filled the air from the moment the doors opened. The punks with their safety pins and ripped clothing eyed the cowboys with their boots and belt buckles. The cowboys eyed the punks with a mixture of confusion and contempt. Beer was thrown. Insults were exchanged. The band antagonized the audience, Johnny Rotten sneering at the crowd between songs, and the audience responded in kind. 4 days later, the Sex Pistols would play their final show in San Francisco, where the band dissolved in acrimony and exhaustion. But that night in Dallas, punk rock had announced itself to Texas, and the music scene would never be quite the same. Texas artists were also making their mark on the national scene. ZZ Top, the bearded rockers from Houston, regularly played Dallas venues on their rise to national fame. Their blues rock sound seemed to capture something essential about Texas, something raw and powerful and authentic. The music scene was one of the ways Dallas was changing, loosening the buttoned-up conservatism that had defined it for generations. Young people who might once have conformed to their parents' expectations were finding new ways to express themselves, new communities to belong to, new sounds to shape their identities. In April of 1978, CBS aired a 5-part miniseries about a wealthy Texas oil family and their feuds, schemes, and romantic entanglements. Nobody expected much from it. The time slot was late on Sunday nights, traditionally a dead zone for television. The producers were not sure it would continue beyond those initial 5 episodes, but audiences responded. The miniseries drew strong enough ratings to earn a pickup for a regular series, and Dallas premiered as a weekly show in September of that year. The show revolved around the Ewing family, owners of an independent oil company called Ewing Oil and a sprawling cattle ranch called South Fork, located just north of Dallas. At the center of the drama was J.R. Ewing, the eldest son, a scheming oil tycoon who would do anything to increase his power and wealth. Larry Hagman played J.R. with a combination of charm and menace that made him one of television's great villains. He smiled as he destroyed competitors. He cheated on his wife Sue Ellen with a parade of mistresses. He manipulated his brothers and betrayed his business partners. He lied and schemed and backstabbed with such gusto that audiences could not look away, and audiences could not get enough of him. The genius of the show was making the villain the most entertaining character on screen. JR was terrible. Everyone knew he was terrible, but watching him scheme was irresistible. The audience rooted against him while secretly admiring his audacity. He was what every ambitious person might become if they abandoned their scruples entirely. South Fork Ranch, the fictional Ewing home, was filmed at a real property in Parker, Texas, about 25 miles north of Dallas. The house had been built in 1970 and was known locally before television transformed it into one of the most famous residences in the world. The ranch became a tourist destination almost immediately. Fans came from across the country, and eventually from around the world, to see the white mansion where the Ewings lived. They posed for photographs at the entrance gate. They imagined themselves at the poolside breakfast table where so much drama had unfolded. Texas Stadium appeared in the opening credits, its distinctive silhouette becoming instantly recognizable to viewers worldwide. The shot established Dallas as a place of ambition and modernity, of gleaming stadiums and towering skylines. The show captured something real about Dallas in the 1970s and early 80s. The oil wealth that JR pursued was the same wealth transforming the actual city. The combination of old money and new money that drove the show's social dynamics mirrored the tensions in real Dallas society. By the end of the 1970s, Dallas was one of the most popular shows on television. International audiences were particularly captivated. The show aired in more than 90 countries, from Europe to Asia to South America. The cliffhanger became the show's signature device. Each season would end with a shocking revelation or dramatic event, leaving viewers to wonder what would happen next over the long summer hiatus. The most famous cliffhanger would come in March of 1980, when the third season ended with JR being shot by an unknown assailant. Who shot JR became a national obsession, discussed in offices and over dinner tables across the country. But that phenomenon lay just beyond the border of the 1970s. The show and the city fed each other in remarkable ways. The real Dallas became more famous because of the fictional Dallas, and the fictional Dallas drew credibility from the real boom happening in the city. When viewers saw JR making deals and accumulating wealth, they knew it was based on something true. Not everything in 1970s Dallas glittered. Beneath the surface of football glory and oil wealth, darker currents ran through the city, currents that most residents preferred not to acknowledge. The cocaine that fueled the party scene did not arrive by magic. It came through smuggling networks, some of them remarkably sophisticated, operated by people who lived in the same neighborhoods as their customers. The Cowboy Mafia was the nickname Dallas media gave to a group of marijuana smugglers who operated throughout Texas during the decade. At their peak, they were reportedly among the most prolific drug smugglers in the state, moving tons of product across the border and into American markets. The group was connected to prominent Texas businessmen who saw drug trafficking as just another entrepreneurial venture, a commodity trade with unusually high profit margins. Banks and legitimate businesses were used to launder the proceeds, the dirty money mixed with clean until no one could tell the difference. The operation ran for years before law enforcement finally caught up, and when the arrests came, the names surprised people who thought they knew their community. Organized crime had a presence in Dallas as well, though not as prominent as in some other American cities. The Dallas crime family, connected to larger networks in New Orleans and Kansas City, had operated gambling and other rackets through the mid-century. The men who ran it lived in nice houses and belonged to civic organizations. They sponsored Little League teams and contributed to charities. By the 1970s, law enforcement believed the family had become largely inactive following the death of its longtime boss, though rumors persisted that successors had simply become more discreet. The mob was not gone, some said, just better hidden. The illegal gambling operations continued, the loan sharking continued. The violence was less visible, but the networks remained. The police faced their own controversies throughout the decade. Relations between the Dallas Police Department and minority communities were often tense, the legacy of decades of discrimination and abuse. Officers who would be polite and professional in Highland Park could be aggressive and dismissive in South Dallas. The badge meant different things in different neighborhoods. High-profile incidents inflamed existing tensions between officers and the communities they served. Shootings that might have been justified, or might not have been, became symbols of systemic injustice. Protests followed. Investigations were launched and completed, usually exonerating the officers involved. Trust eroded further with each cycle. South Dallas remained a world apart from the glittering nightlife of Greenville Avenue and the wealth of Highland Park. The neighborhood had been the center of Black Dallas since the Jim Crow era. when segregation confined African Americans to specific areas of the city. By the 1970s, many of the formal barriers had fallen, but the economic disparities remained stark. While North Dallas boomed with new construction and young professionals, South Dallas struggled with poverty, unemployment, and neglected infrastructure. The schools were underfunded compared to their suburban counterparts. Job opportunities were limited, the businesses that had once served the community having closed or moved away. The contrast with the prosperity visible elsewhere created frustration and resentment that would simmer for decades. West Dallas was even more desperate, a neighborhood of unpaved streets and substandard housing where some residents still lacked indoor plumbing. The Lids smelter that had operated there for decades had poisoned the soil and the children, leaving a legacy of illness that would take generations to address. The residents were poor, mostly Mexican-American, and largely invisible to the Dallas that celebrated itself on television. Even in the prosperous parts of Dallas, not everything was as it seemed. The same banks that were lending freely to oil speculators were making decisions that would lead to collapse. Loans were approved on handshakes and optimism, the collateral valued at inflated prices, the due diligence perfunctory at best. The savings and loan institutions that proliferated across Texas were taking risks that would eventually destroy them. Deregulation had freed them to invest in speculative real estate, and they had plunged in eagerly. When the investments went bad, the institutions would fail, and the taxpayers would be left with the bill. The real estate developments going up on former farmland were sometimes built on fraud and wishful thinking. Appraisers inflated values. Developers took fees and moved on to the next project. The buyers assumed appreciation would make everything work out. Sometimes it did, often it did not. The bust would come eventually. It always does after a boom. But in the 1970s, few people wanted to think about that. The party was too good, the money too easy, the future too bright with apparent possibility. What was it actually like to live in Dallas during the 1970s? Beyond the headlines and the history, what did ordinary life feel like for the hundreds of thousands of people who called this city home? Imagine waking up in an apartment in the village on a Saturday morning in, say, 1976. The air conditioning hums against the Texas heat, working to keep the interior comfortable while the temperature outside climbs toward triple digits. The unit vibrates slightly with the effort, a background noise so constant you barely notice it anymore. Through the thin walls you can hear your neighbour's radio playing, maybe the Eagles or Fleetwood Mac or that new disco song everyone seems to be dancing to. The smell of bacon drifts through from somewhere, making your stomach growl. You make coffee in a percolator, the old-fashioned kind that fills the kitchen with that distinctive bubbling sound, because drip machines are still a novelty that most people have not yet adopted. The morning paper lies on your doorstep, delivered before dawn by a teenager earning money for college or a car. You flip through it with your coffee, catching up on the news. The Cowboys are preparing for their next game. Another office tower is breaking ground downtown. A local politician is embroiled in some scandal that will be forgotten by next week. If you have plans for the afternoon, maybe you head to North Park Center, the shopping mall that opened in 1965 and quickly became a Dallas institution. You drive there, of course, because Dallas is a car city, designed around the automobile. Its distance is too vast and its public transit too limited for any other option. North Park was different from other malls of the era. It featured serious art in its public spaces, sculptures and paintings that would be at home in a museum. The architecture was clean and modern, with gardens and fountains creating an atmosphere of sophisticated calm amid the commerce. Skylights brought natural light into the corridors. The stores were upscale, catering to the tastes of a city that was learning to think of itself as sophisticated. You might browse the stores, have lunch at one of the restaurants, see a movie at the cinema. The mall was becoming the center of suburban social life, replacing the downtowns of an earlier generation. Teenagers gathered there on weekends. Families made it a destination. The food court hummed with conversation. Valley View Mall offered another option, more middle class in its orientation, its stores catering to families rather than aspirational shoppers. Prestonwood Center was growing in the northern suburbs, following the population as it spread ever outward across the prairie. For dinner, the options reflected the city's character and its history. Tex-Mex was a Dallas staple, the fusion cuisine born from the border region, where Texas and Mexico blended together into something, neither quite one nor the other. El Fenix had been serving enchiladas and tacos and chili con carne since 1918, its locations gathering places for generations of Dallas families. The cheese enchiladas came smothered in chili gravy, a combination that would puzzle a visitor from Mexico City but seemed perfectly natural to anyone raised in Texas. The chips and salsa arrived before you even ordered, warm and salty and addictive. The margaritas were served in glasses the size of your head. Barbecue offered another option, Texas-style beef brisket smoked low and slow over post oak until it achieved that perfect combination of crispy bark and tender meat. Sonny Bryan's operated from a tiny building near Love Field Airport, its smoke visible from blocks away, the line stretching out the door at lunchtime. You ate standing up or in your car because there was barely room inside for the pit, let alone customers with plates. Steakhouses catered to the business crowd and special occasions. Dallas had money, and money liked red meat. Thick cuts of beef served on sizzling platters with baked potatoes and salad bars. The cattlemen who had built fortunes on Texas ranches wanted to eat what they raised, and the oil men who had more recently made their millions were happy to join them. On Sundays, much of Dallas went to church. This was still the Bible Belt, and Baptist churches anchored communities throughout the city. First Baptist Dallas, with its massive downtown campus, was one of the largest congregations in America. Its pastor was a figure of civic importance. His sermons reported in the newspapers, his opinions sought on matters ranging from politics to morality. Smaller churches served neighborhoods and suburbs, their parking lots filling every Sunday morning with families in their best clothes. Sunday school preceded the main service. Potluck dinners followed. The church was not just a place of worship, but a center of community life, where people met their neighbors, found support in difficult times, celebrated milestones together. The rhythm of life was shaped by the seasons, though in Texas the seasons were less about cold and snow and more about gradations of heat. Summer arrived early, in April or May, and stayed late, often through October. Months of temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees made outdoor activity an early morning or late evening pursuit. Air conditioning was not a luxury but a necessity, the technology that had made modern Dallas possible. Without it, no one would willingly live through a Texas summer. The houses were sealed tight against the heat, their windows rarely opened, their inhabitants moving from air-conditioned home to air-conditioned car to air-conditioned office. Spring brought bluebonnets to the highway medians and the fields outside of town, the state flower painting the landscape in brilliant blue. Families would drive out to photograph their children sitting among the flowers, an annual ritual that filled photo albums across the state. Fall brought football, and football in Texas was not just a sport but a religion of its own. High school games on Friday nights drew entire communities to stadiums across the Metroplex. Towns that could barely afford to maintain their roads built football stadiums that seated thousands. The marching bands performed at halftime. The cheerleaders led the cheers. The whole community gathered under the lights. Saturday meant college football, the Longhorns or Aggies or SMU Mustangs depending on your allegiances and your history. The rivalries were fierce and inherited, passed down through families like eye colour or surname. You were raised a Longhorn or an Aggie, and you would die one, and you would raise your children to follow your team, and Sunday meant the Cowboys. If you could not get tickets to Texas Stadium, you watched on television. Families gathered around sets in living rooms, the men shouting at referees' calls, second-guessing plays, celebrating touchdowns with the same passion they would show at the stadium itself. The women might participate, or might retreat to the kitchen or the backyard, depending on their interest and their tolerance for shouting. Children played outside until dark, riding bicycles through suburban streets, gathering for pickup games of football or baseball in vacant lots. The concept of stranger danger had not yet taken hold. Parents trusted their neighborhoods, or at least trusted them enough to let kids roam without constant supervision. You came home when the streetlights came on. The State Fair of Texas came every October, transforming Fair Park into a carnival of fried food and carnival rides. Big Tex, the 52-foot-tall cowboy statue, welcomed visitors with a booming greeting that could be heard across the grounds. Fletcher's corny dogs were essential eating, the corn-battered hot dogs on sticks that had been invented at the fair decades before. Cotton candy and funnel cakes and fried everything competed for attention. The Cotton Bowl hosted the annual Texas-Oklahoma football game, half the stadium in burnt orange and half in crimson, the fans separated by a line down the middle of the field. The rivalry was personal and passionate, and the game determined bragging rights for an entire year. Winter, such as it was, brought the occasional ice storm that shut down the city. Dallas did not own snowplows because snow was rare enough to be a novelty. When it came, schools closed and offices emptied, and children went outside to experience this strange white substance falling from the sky. The ice melted within days, and life returned to normal. It was, in many ways, a simpler time, though that simplicity was partly illusion. The problems were real even if people preferred not to discuss them. The inequalities were vast even if they were easy to ignore from the right zip code. Racism persisted in housing patterns and hiring practices even as the legal structures of segregation fell away. Women faced barriers in the workplace that would be illegal within a generation. Gay residents lived in shadows, their existence acknowledged only in whispers. But for those who fit into the mainstream of Dallas society, the 1970s offered a quality of life that felt, at least in the moment, like something close to ideal. The economy was growing, housing was affordable, the future seemed bright with possibility. As 1979 turned to 1980, Dallas stood at a remarkable moment in its history, poised between past achievement and uncertain future. The Cowboys had just returned from another Super Bowl, their 5th appearance in 9 years, though they had lost to Pittsburgh in a game that came down to the final minutes. It had been a classic, 35-31, both teams trading touchdowns until the final whistle. Roger Staubach would retire after the season, ending an era but leaving behind a legacy of excellence that would define the franchise for generations. Captain Comeback. The nickname followed him into retirement, a reminder of all those fourth-quarter rallies, all those games that seemed lost until Staubach found a way to win. 23 times he had led the Cowboys back from fourth-quarter deficits to victory. The Hall of Fame awaited him, a certainty from the moment he announced his retirement. The television show, Dallas, was about to air the episode that would make it a global phenomenon. In March of 1980, someone would shoot J.R. Ewing in his office at Ewing Oil, and for the next 8 months the world would wonder who had pulled the trigger. Who Shot J.R. would become the biggest cultural event in television history, discussed in offices and over dinner tables across the country and around the world. The resolution, aired in November of 1980, would draw more than 80 million American viewers, the highest-rated episode of any television series in history at that time. It was a shared cultural moment, one of the last before cable television and the internet would fragment audiences into smaller and smaller niches. Oil prices continued to climb as the decade ended, reaching highs that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The Iranian Revolution had disrupted supplies, and the resulting panic had pushed prices to $40 a barrel, more than 10 times what they had been before the first oil crisis. The money kept flowing into Dallas, feeding the construction boom that was transforming the skyline. New towers rose downtown, their mirrored glass reflecting the Texas sun. Reunion Tower was under construction, its distinctive ball shape soon to become a symbol of the city. The Hyatt Regency was expanding, office buildings were going up faster than anyone could count them. The cheerleaders had become international ambassadors, travelling on USO tours and appearing on television shows around the world. Their poster remained one of the best-selling images in America. The squad that had started as a publicity experiment had become an institution, as famous as the team they cheered for. The transformation from a city known for tragedy to a city known for triumph was complete. When people around the world thought of Dallas now, they thought of football and oil and glamour, of J.R. Ewing and Roger Staubach and those cheerleaders in their blue and white uniforms. It was a remarkable act of civic rebranding, accomplished not through advertising campaigns, but through achievement and entertainment that people actually wanted to consume. But there were warning signs for those willing to see them, shadows at the edge of the bright future everyone assumed was inevitable. The oil market that had fueled the boom was based on artificial scarcity created by OPEC's production limits. If those limits loosened, if new supplies came online from Alaska, or the North Sea or elsewhere, prices could fall as quickly as they had risen. The wells that had made fortunes at $40 a barrel might become worthless at $20. The real estate market was showing signs of overbuilding. Office towers were going up faster than tenants could fill them. The vacancy rates were climbing, though developers kept building, confident that growth would continue forever. The banks that had lent freely during the boom years would eventually need to collect on those loans, and many of the borrowers were already stretched thin. The savings and loan institutions that had proliferated across Texas were taking risks that would eventually destroy them. The regulations that had governed them for decades had been loosened, allowing them to invest in speculative real estate deals that promised enormous returns. When those deals went bad, the institutions would collapse, taking depositors' money with them and requiring the largest government bailout in American history. The party culture that had defined the decade was beginning to exact its toll. Cocaine addiction was destroying lives, the drug that had seemed so glamorous revealing its darker side. Careers were derailed, marriages ended. Some users progressed from recreational use to dependence to desperation. The hangover from the party was setting in. Drunk driving was killing people on the highways, the permissive laws that allowed open containers in vehicles enabling tragedies that would eventually force reform. Mothers Against Drunk Driving was organising, demanding stricter laws and harsher penalties. The era of drinking and driving without consequence was ending. AIDS was emerging, though no one knew yet what it was or how it spread. In San Francisco and New York, young men were dying of mysterious illnesses that baffled doctors. The epidemic that would ravage the gay community through the 1980s was just beginning, its horrors still hidden in the future. The 1980s would bring changes that no one in 1979 could have predicted. The bust would come, and it would be devastating. Oil prices would collapse, banks would fail, the gleaming towers would empty out, fortunes that had seemed permanent would evaporate overnight. But that is a story for another night. Tonight we remember Dallas as it was at the end of the 1970s. A city transformed. A city that had taken tragedy and turned it into triumph. A city of football dynasties and cheerleader revolutions, of oil fortunes and disco nights, of television dreams and real-world ambitions. The people who lived through it did not know they were creating history. They were just living their lives, going to work and going to clubs, watching football games and raising families. They were chasing success and finding it, or chasing it and failing, in a city that promised everything was possible if you worked hard enough or got lucky enough. That is always the way with history. It only becomes history in retrospect. In the moment, it is just life. The lights are dimming now at Texas Stadium. The crowd has filed out into the cool October night, their voices still buzzing with excitement over another Cowboys victory. Car engines start across the vast parking lot, headlights flickering on like fireflies emerging at dusk, thousands of them, creating rivers of light that flow toward the highways. Somewhere in that parking lot, a father is carrying his sleeping child to the car. The boy is worn out from the excitement, exhausted from the noise and the cheering, from the hot dogs and the sodas and the sheer sensory overload of his first Cowboys game. But even in sleep, he clutches a pennant he will keep for the rest of his life, the star logo pressed against his small chest. Decades from now, he will show that pennant to his own children and tell them about the night he saw the Cowboys play, the night the crowd roared so loud he could feel it in his chest. He will describe the way the stadium lights made everything glow, the way 65,000 people rose to their feet at once when Staubach threw a touchdown pass. He will tell them it was magic, and he will not be exaggerating. Across town, the clubs are just getting started. Young professionals are gathering at bars along Greenville Avenue, ordering drinks and scanning the crowd for familiar faces or new possibilities. The disco ball spins overhead, casting fragments of light across the dance floor like stars scattered across a dance floor. The music pulses with that distinctive beat that defined an era, the bass line thumping through the speakers and into your chest. A woman in a halter top and bell-bottoms catches the eye of a man in a polyester shirt. They smile. They move closer. The night is young and full of possibility. Whatever happens between them, they will remember this moment, this time, this place where everything seemed possible and the future stretched out infinite before them. In Highland Park, behind the manicured hedges and imposing facades, families are settling in for the evening. The chandeliers dim in the formal dining rooms where dinner has concluded. Perhaps they are watching television in the den, the fictional Ewings scheming on screen while real schemes unfold in boardrooms downtown. Or perhaps they are planning their week ahead, the charity galas and country club dinners, the business lunches and social obligations that structure their lives. Their children are upstairs, supervised by nannies or au pairs, growing up in a world of privilege that will shape everything they become, and in apartments across the city, in the suburbs that stretch toward the horizon in every direction, in the neighborhoods old and new that make up this sprawling metropolis, people are going about their lives, making dinner, putting children to bed, planning for tomorrow, dreaming of what they might become. A young accountant is reviewing numbers at his kitchen table, preparing for a presentation that might earn him a promotion. A nurse is getting ready for the night shift, putting on her uniform and checking her watch. A mechanic is having a beer after a long day, watching television and thinking about the car he is rebuilding in his garage. A teacher is grading papers, red pen moving across page after page of student work. None of them know that they are living through a particular moment in history. None of them feel the weight of the era the way we feel it looking back. For them, it is just Tuesday night. It is just their life. The decade has no label yet, no shape or meaning beyond the days as they pass. This was Dallas in the 1970s, a city of contradictions and ambitions, of glamour and shadows, of remarkable achievement and troubling inequalities. A city that took one of the worst moments in American history and somehow emerged transformed, wearing a new identity that would define it for decades. The Kennedy assassination would never be forgotten. Dealey Plaza would always carry that weight of history, the tourists coming to stand where the motorcade passed, to look up at the window where the shots were fired. But Dallas had found a way to become something more, to add new chapters to its story, to give the world new images and new associations. When you thought of Dallas after the 1970s, you might still think of November 1963, but you would also think of Texas Stadium and the Cowboys, of cheerleaders and oil wealth, of the Ewing family and their endless scheming. The city had not erased its past, but it had created a future compelling enough to compete with it. The skyline would continue to grow in the decades ahead, towers rising ever higher, the city spreading ever outward across the Texas plains. The bust would come and the boom would return and the bust would come again, the cycles of fortune that define Texas history repeating themselves generation after generation. The Cowboys would have lean years and glory years, championships and disappointments, but they would remain America's team, the brand too powerful to diminish. The village would eventually be redeveloped, its aging apartments replaced by newer construction. Greenville Avenue would transform from singles bars to upscale restaurants and back again. The nightlife would shift to other neighborhoods, Deep Ellum and Uptown, as the generations changed and the fashions evolved. But something of the 1970s would remain in the city's DNA, a memory of that moment when Dallas reinvented itself, when oil money flowed freely and the Cowboys won championships, and the cheerleaders danced, and the whole world watched a television show named after the city. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, dear friends. I hope this journey through 1970s, Dallas has given you something to dream about as you drift off to sleep. Perhaps you will dream of Texas, Stadium, the lights blazing and the crowd roaring, the energy of 65,000 people united in hope. Perhaps you will dream of disco nights and live music, of Neiman Marcus elegance and oil-field fortunes, of a city reaching for greatness and, for one shining decade, touching it. If you enjoyed this journey through time, please do subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support helps bring more stories like this one to your ears, more nights of history and imagination to carry you into sleep. Leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight. I love hearing from you, learning about the places and people who have found their way to these stories. Perhaps you have connections to 1970s Dallas, memories of your own, or stories passed down from parents and grandparents. Perhaps your family lived there, worked there, watched the Cowboys at Texas Stadium, or danced at clubs along Greenville Avenue. I would love to hear your stories. Until next time, dear friends, sleep well, dream of better days and brighter tomorrows, and remember that history is not just something that happened long ago to people very different from ourselves. It is the story of people just like us, living their lives, making their choices, creating the world that we inherited. The past is not so far away. It lives in the stories we tell, in the buildings that still stand, in the memories passed down through families. Close your eyes, and you can almost hear the crowd at Texas Stadium, almost smell the popcorn, almost feel the energy of 65,000 people believing together that their team could not lose. The lights are off now at the stadium. The parking lot is empty. The city sleeps, dreaming of tomorrow. Good night.